Hi, welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the third one in a series on getting started with humanistic psychology, that is to say, providing you with a sense for humanistic psychology's basic direction, also providing you with some of the basic vocabulary we'll be using throughout the semester. In this particular video, what we're going to be doing is starting a rather lengthy compare and contrast operation between natural science modes of psychology and humanistic psychology, especially with respect to their underlying philosophical foundation. Okay, so this video will focus for the most part on natural science modes of psychology, and the next video, if we get that far, will focus more on humanistic psychology. So, step one. What is the philosophical foundation of natural science modes of psychology? Now, before we launch into this, I'd like for you to remember something that I mentioned in the previous video, which is that for the most part, the model of reality upon which natural science modes of psychology is based is not a 20th century or 21st century physics model of reality. What it is a more or less Newtonian, an older model of how reality works. Okay, so bear that in mind, and if you do, that might make some of this material more accessible and more comprehensible to you. So, natural science modes of psychology, more or less psychology in the Newtonian paradigm. Basic datum, what's the whole thing based upon? Well, observations of a world, and those observations are supposed to be separable from our subjective experience of it. The point is that if you're doing science, you don't want your conclusions and your insights and your inferences to be based on your subjective experience. What you want them to be based on is direct and verifiable observations of the objective world that is supposed to have a reality status that is separable from your subjective experience of it. And that's what you really want. You don't want elements of your opinion or your feelings or any other element of your subjectivity to be entering into your thought processes or your conclusions. So, if the entire thing is based upon observations of an objective world that is separable from your subjective experience of it, what that more or less implies is that it's viewing reality in a dualistic way. Okay, so what's a dualistic way mean? Well, dualism, the word that appears in your notes, kind of has the word dual in it, and dual means two of something. All right, so an underlying dualism means an account of reality in terms of two fundamental things. That ultimately what reality boils down to is two fundamental things, and usually the way it's cast is the two fundamental things are what I mentioned a minute ago, the objective world or objectivity, and subjective experience or subjectivity. Now, this is an account of reality that has rather a lengthy pedigree within the Western world, and usually the mooring point for that pedigree is localized in the work of Rene Descartes, who was an Enlightenment era thinker. He lived from 1596 to 1650, yes. And he had a way of thinking about reality in terms of what he called res cogitans, in the Latin in which he wrote, which means a thinking thing. That's the element of subjectivity. And then res extensa, or a thing extended in space. Okay, so basically the point is that he had a way of conceiving of reality in this particular way, that there's the objective world and then there's subjective experience. In other words, reality is basically the sum total of the two of those. All right, so okay, so Rene Descartes. So when you hear of a Cartesian view of the world or a Cartesian view of reality, usually what people mean is a dualistic account where the objective world is taken to be separate from our subjective experience. So a dualism in the tradition of Descartes, as I say in your notes, and also the philosophy of logical positivism. Okay, so usually the way this dualistic account is rendered in our modern world, however, is not just that there's an objective side to reality and a subjective side to reality. Rather, the objective side to reality is usually seen as the more important one, especially with respect to scientific inquiry. Like I said a minute ago, if you're doing science, what you want is objective truth. Okay, so the objective reality has a kind of priority, and subjective experience in a way is demoted within this framework, okay, this kind of Newtonian scientific framework. So objective reality is seen as primary and the cause of everything. Okay, that's a pretty loaded statement that we'll unpack pretty soon in this video, but for now just sort of ride with it. And subjective experience is seen as, and here comes a vocabulary word probably for a lot of you, epiphenomenal. Okay, can you say epiphenomenal? I feel like Mr. Rogers a little bit. I knew you could. Okay, so epiphenomenal, when something is epiphenomenal, what it means is it's a secondary or derivative expression of something that is seen to be more primary. Well, what's the thing that's seen to be more primary? Well, the thing that I just told you, the objective world. Okay, so subjectivity is seen to be epiphenomenal with respect to the objective world. Okay, so a secondary or derivative expression. And what you ought to be inferring is that there's a kind of demotion, in a way, of subjective experience with respect to objective truth in this point of view. It's subjective experience is usually seen as an effect of primary causes located in the objective world. And probably the easiest place to see this, although there are many, is the whole point of view that says, well, everything you experience is just a manifestation of your brain working in a certain way, that your central nervous system, or more specifically your brain, works in a certain way, and it produces all of the things that you seem to be experiencing. Okay, so your thoughts and your meaning and your values and your sense that you're deciding things is really just an expression of the material world, and more specifically the material world of your brain working in the particular way it does, all right, according to the principles that govern biochemistry, for instance, and hence neurotransmission would be an example of that, that everything you think, everything you feel, everything you experience is ultimately about what's going on in the objective world. All right, so science's job, given that framework, science's job, and, you know, natural science psychology's job is to answer the question that seems from our cultural point of view to be the most cutting important question you could ask about pretty much anything, and that is why. That little 3-word question, 12 points in Scrabble, why? Okay, so the question at this point is, what are people really asking when they ask the question why? And what they're asking is, it kind of goes like this. When people say, why X? It doesn't matter what the X is. What they're really saying is, I've observed something in the world, and I'm about to ask you to give an account of how it is that other things in the world have caused and therefore brought about the thing that I'm asking you about. Okay, that might have seemed slightly complicated, so let me say it again. When I ask the question why, I'm asking you for an explanation of how it is that some set of anterior causes have brought about the thing I'm asking you why about. All right, and the trick, the thing I'm trying to sort of get you to realize, is how wedded to a very causal way of viewing reality the question why is. Okay, so that if you have an idea that there are other operative forces in the universe besides sort of strict causality, the way we think of it, the question why may not necessarily be always the most cutting, direct, and important question you might ask about anything. It's just that from a particular viewpoint, the viewpoint of the natural sciences, the way psychology has appropriated them, the question why seems like the most important question. And that's probably true of our culture generally. It's not just, you know, natural science modes of psychology. Probably within our cultural practices, the question why most of the time, 99% of the time, seems like the most important question you could possibly ask about anything. What you're looking for when you ask why, and I kind of said this maybe a little too fast when I said it a second ago, is an explanation. Okay? You're looking for an explanation. And once again, this is the third time I'll say it, what an explanation is an account of how previous causes are bringing about the thing you're asking why about. All right? So, all right, it's a very causally laden question. So implications of this view of reality. Okay. The idea that everything is caused by something else in this universe, that everything in this universe is an expression of other things that have caused it. Okay, that causality is ultimately the only principle of reality, the only operative principle of reality. Everything, every single thing, and that includes human beings too, which is the primary topic matter of psychology, is caused by something else. Okay, or sometimes several somethings else. Sometimes causality can be more tricky, right? So several things operating in concert, but still bringing about any given thing in the universe, including us. All right? All phenomena are therefore determined and determinate. What are they determined by? Well, the operation of causality, obviously. All right? Hence, the universe as a whole is determinate and ultimately knowable via empirical scientific inquiry. So the whole project of science from this point of view is to sort of trace out and understand how causality operates, sometimes in tricky, complicated ways, but still, it's a causal game that's being played. If you want to ask about anything and understand it, you need to know the causes that bring it about. Because everything, and I keep saying that word everything, and I hope you're hearing how inclusive that is. Everything means kind of a lot of stuff, all right, in the universe. Okay, so that might be an example of my somewhat quirky sense of humor, like everything is a lot of stuff. Yeah, okay. All right, so the entire universe as a whole is determinate and ultimately knowable by empirical scientific inquiry. All we basically have to do is turn the crank long enough and we'll understand life, the universe, and everything. And that's a lot of stuff, as I said. Okay, so all human existence is part of everything. All right, so everything human is a subset of everything in the universe. Okay, so things like your freedom, like I said in I think it was the last video, is a kind of illusion from that point of view. Well, why is that? Because every choice you make is, like everything else in the universe, being produced by some set of causes that comes before it. Okay, so you never make a choice, as it were. It's just that it looks like you're making choices, but really what's happening is there's a set of causal factors that is producing the illusion that you are making choices. All right, so once again, it's your brain. Let's say it's your brain working in a certain way, okay, and it's sort of producing the sensation that you're choosing something, but really what's going on is matter is interacting in a certain way, the matter that composes your brain, and because of that, you're fooled into thinking that you're free. Okay, that you make decisions, that you have choices, and so on and so forth. And like I said in the previous video, your responsibility is also an illusion, therefore, from this point of view. You know, like in a universe where everything is caused and that's all that's going on, your freedom and your responsibility are illusions. Okay, so that might start to piss you off, you know, because basically what it's saying is, like I said before, you're kind of a puppet dancing on the strings of causality. You know, that's all there is. That's all there is to you. Even your sense of who you are is an effect produced by some set of anterior causes. You know, your choices, your values, everything. All you are is a puppet dancing on the strings of causality. And I'm trying to say it in a way that irritates you slightly, you know. Now, the next thing I wanted to do in this particular video is talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of this point of view. And we'll see how far into this we get. I'm not sure we'll complete all this, but now here I have to give you a warning. These advantages and disadvantages are only going to appear to you to be advantages and disadvantages from a particular perspective. So some of these things I mentioned by way of advantages, they might not appear to you to be advantages unless you're able to adopt the perspective from which they can appear to be advantages. And the same is true of the disadvantages too. So advantages of this point of view from the perspective of things like natural science psychology. Okay, so if you can sort of put at least one foot in that perspective, here are some of the advantages that might appear. Well, this way of seeing reality and consequently this way of doing psychology, it tends to follow Occam's Razor. Okay, you sort of have to remember what that is from one of the last two videos. I can't remember which one it was. Hence, it makes psychology's project seem simpler because Occam's Razor is a principle of simplicity. You know, if you have competing explanations and all other factors are equal, prefer the simpler one. Or as William of Occam said, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. All right, so quoting William of Occam from the 14th century. So it tends to make psychology's project more simple, and we tend to like things that are simpler. Seems like an advantage. Okay, second advantage, it comes to the kind of understanding acceptable to science in general. Okay, so it makes psychology seem more scientific and consequently more acceptable. Psychological truths seem more palatable to not just the scientific community, but insofar as our culture is also a kind of, it worships at the temple of science a lot of the time, it makes psychology seem more acceptable to our larger culture. And of course, it tends to yield correct, reliable explanation. And I'm sort of emphasizing that word explanation, like that. Remember what we just said about explanation a couple minutes ago, that it's about giving a set of causes, a kind of rendering of the causal factors that bring something about. So it tends to produce correct, reliable explanation, and once again, our Western culture tends to love that sort of thing. So it's going to find psychology's project to be more acceptable, or at least less dubious, let's put it that way. All right, so those are some of the principal advantages. Now, problems with this way of operating. Okay, so problems from the perspective of something like humanistic psychology. Once again, these things are only going to appear to you to be problems insofar as you can put at least one of your feet in a humanistic psychological point of view. All right, otherwise they're not going to seem to be problems at all. So problem number one, natural science psychology often produces knowledge that's correct. That's not the problem, but that often seems inconsequential. All right, so if you model psychology on the paradigm of the natural sciences really zealously, a peculiar kind of quality tends to emerge over time with respect to its findings. And the quality is that they don't seem all that relevant to life as we know it, right? Like life where we live and breathe. Yeah, you can solve a few problems by that kind of approach, but like for the most part, psychology will fail to speak to our souls, in essence. You know, like it'll sort of fail to be an impressive and meaningful account of what human existence is about in some way. Like it'll sort of fall short of that, you know. Okay, so its findings often fail to matter much to people because its findings usually don't speak directly to their experience in life. But of course, as we've already seen, experience is treated as epiphenomenal in the first place. So who cares whether psychology's project ends up speaking to us where we live and breathe? Well, some people care. Some people have an expectation, and I think it's a reasonable one, that at least at certain points psychology should say something truly meaningful to the human race. I don't know, it might sound kind of crazy to you, but some people think that way, myself being one. All right, so... All right, it often produces, and here's my sarcastic phrase for it, so what psychology? Okay, so I invented this phrase. I made this. Okay, so what psychology? So that's the kind of psychology that produces factually correct insights, but insights that don't seem to matter all that much, whether they're true or not, at least to, 95% of the population. Right? So if you're failing to speak in some important, significant way to 95% of the population, you can wonder what the real value of your enterprise is in the first place. So it tends to produce so what psychology whose understandings are merely correct. And I took that phrase from a philosopher, Martin Heidegger, whom was a very interesting 20th century, phenomenological thinker. Okay, so what psychology whose understandings are merely correct. In other words, it's possible for, I bet you know this, right? From your experience as students, that probably some fraction of the information you absorb is merely correct. Okay, it's not like it's wrong. It's like it doesn't seem all that relevant whether you know it or not. You know, I don't know if you've ever had that sensation in your sort of trip through the academic world, which is more or less occupied, let's say, the last decade and a half of your life, which, by the way, is actually an appreciable fraction of your entire lifespan. Like, so I think it's not such a bad thing to be questioning the real value of it. Well, here's a way of questioning it. Like, how much of what you have learned in the last 15 years of your life really speaks to your experience as a human being in an important, significant, and foundational way, and how much of it is really just sort of triviality, you know, that it doesn't matter whether you know it that much or not, you know. So, and I think if you're like most of us, it's like, well, every now and then you come upon a really powerful, significant truth, but kind of there's like mountains of sort of junk you have to get through to get to the few luminous, powerful statements. So that's in essence the problem, that natural science psychology tends to produce mountains of trivial insights that are correct, but they're merely correct. Maybe like a lot of the stuff you've absorbed like I had this sense when I was a kid even, you know, that like, wow, a lot of this stuff doesn't seem all that important to know. And I was a little bit of a rebel as a kid. I can own that, you know, and I'm probably still a little bit of a rebel, to be honest. But like even then I sort of had a sense like, like what makes this so damn important to know? It's like, do you know the capital of ancient Assyria? Like, well, it's like Nineveh, right? Like that is correct. And it's like, does it really matter that I know that? Probably not. Okay, so to intensify the complaint, it tends to meaning taking this natural science approach, tends to understand human existence as devoid of a lot of things that seemingly make it worthwhile in the first place, like devoid of magic, devoid of romance, devoid of the sense of the sacred, devoid of mystery, devoid of the sense of the miraculous in life. Well, for some people, that's a pretty damn high price to pay. Maybe it's too high price to pay for some people, because for a lot of people, all of that stuff that is not very directly accessible by way of a natural scientific model is what makes life living in the first place. And doesn't it seem strange that, you know, psychology would sort of absent itself from exploring all of that? Well, it seems bizarre. It's a little bit more than strange. It might even be perverse. So I said at the end, and this is a reference to a set of books, actually. The first book is the most famous, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I actually made an oblique reference to that earlier in the chapter for those keeping track of the literary references, but it's a little like asking, what is the meaning of life? And receiving the answer 42. Okay, now here's the trick to this. Like, at a certain level of description, 42 may be a correct answer to that question. Like maybe from a certain perspective, like the ultimate crystallization of all of life's significance and all of life's meaning is in the number 42. The problem is not that the answer is wrong. The problem is that the answer is not very satisfying to most people. Okay, so maybe one person in 1,000 is satisfied by that answer, and it's like, well, all the pieces are in place now, and I can ascend to the God realm or something like that. And it's like, yeah, for the 999 rest of us, it ain't that way. Okay, so it's a little like that. Like you ask for what the meaning of life is, and someone tells you 42, and it's like, well, all right. So it doesn't satisfy the animating spirit of the original question is the essential problem. Now, problem number 2, and this is going to be a theoretical problem that René Descartes ran into when he was articulating this dualistic account of how reality works, and it goes like this. If objective reality is indeed separable from our subjective experience of it, then you're stuck with the problem of giving an account of how the two influence one another, because it seems pretty damn obvious that they do. For instance, you can have a thought in your subjective experience, and it can very quickly translate into an alteration in the objective material world. For instance, I'm having a thought right now that I'm going to pick up my cell phone back here. A thought in my subjective experience, I'm going to translate it into manipulating objects in the empirically verifiable world. Oh my goodness. I have moved a mass of matter from one side of the room to the other. We keep our examples real simple in this class, by the way. You know, so, well, how could that happen if my subjective experience is radically separable from the materiality of the objective world? Or it works the other way around, too. It's like sometimes things in the objective world affect your subjectivity, and if you don't believe that, like try drinking some coffee sometimes, okay? Because coffee contains, you know, the caffeine molecule, which can very quickly affect how you subjectively experience things. So you're a little more hyped up and maybe a little more energetic and anxious, possibly too. So, you know, it's always running both ways, but if the two are separated out, then you're stuck with the problem of providing an account of how that happens. Now, Rene Descartes was stuck with this same problem as he was developing his philosophy, and here was his so-called solution to it. Where subjectivity meets the objective world, it happens in the pineal gland. Okay, so what's the pineal gland? Well, it's a little gland in your head, like right about here, except about an inch deep in your head. And so his answer, this is really not an answer, that's why I'm laughing, is that it happens in the pineal gland. And the reason why it's not an answer is this. It's like just specifying a location doesn't answer the question of how those things affect one another. I mean, you might as well say it happens in your elbow, or it happens in your little toe, the little piggy wig that went wee 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 all the way home, like, or it happens in you know, the islets of Langerhans in your pancreas or something like that. Like, it doesn't, specifying a location doesn't answer the essential question. But then he died very soon after that. He became sick, and I don't know if he had coronavirus or not, probably not. Maybe he had the Black Plague or something like that, which was the coronavirus back in the day, you know, so Black Death. At any rate, the problem is that you're still stuck with this lack of an explanation in a dualistic account. So how can a feeling be caused? How can anything in your subjectivity be caused if the objective world is indeed separable from your subjective experience of it? How can a thought change the world? You know, whether it's in the form of like a cell phone being moved around or any other object, or you know, people launching rockets off into space. You know, that there was an element of subjectivity that motivated that. People had dreams of flying. They saw the birds, and because of their dreams, eventually they sort of figured out how to do it. Well, how would that be possible if things like dreams, which are elements of your subjectivity, are fundamentally separable from the operation of the objective world? So the problem sort of crystallizes in this. There's always a gap between the causal explanations and our experience. And like, and the same thing happens, you know, like in the cases of, you know, sort of neurotransmission and accounts of subjective experience in terms of neurotransmission. Like, you know, like certain neurotransmitters that are known to affect our subjective states, like serotonin is one, dopamine is another, epinephrine and norepinephrine are two other ones. There's a range of neurotransmitters that are known to affect our subjective experience. Well, how does giving me that account explain like why being sad feels like being sad? You getting it? It's like, well, you know, the neurotransmissions, like, you know, there's like sort of not enough of them in this particular area of the central nervous system. Yeah, but why does sadness feel like sadness? Like, how does that explanation give me a convincing account of why sadness feels to me like sadness? Are you getting it? There's a gap between sort of the neurotransmission account, which by the way is coherent and interesting. So I'm not putting it down, but the problem is that, like, if you get too reliant on that, you're never going to investigate the question you're probably really interested in, which is, why does sadness feel like sadness? Why does happiness feel like happiness? And so on down the line. Right? You know, so there's always this kind of weird gap between the causal account and our actual subjective experience, between neurology and our subjectivity, to put it bluntly. Okay, so the third problem is that there's something radically anti-scientific at the heart of natural science psychology. And the reason why is because natural science psychology is usually very resistant to asking these sorts of questions about like the nature of reality or the nature of existence or the nature of being and so on. Well, the thing about science is that the animating spirit of science is never to not ask a question about something that's important. And I know that's a double negative. They told you not to do that in English class. So let me say it again. The animating spirit of science is always to ask a question. And the more foundational the question is, the more important it is to ask it. That's the animating spirit of science. It's kind of like license plates from Missouri. It says the ShowMeState. And that would be sort of a great little compact way of describing the animating spirit of science. You don't just accept things because they're matters of social convention or, because the king or the president said so or, anyone else says so. It's like, show me that it's true. Show me in the world where this is true. Well, the thing is, like if you have a mode of psychology that doesn't want to be asking questions about the nature of reality or the nature of existence, well, isn't there a strange contradiction in that? Because you would think that questions about reality and existence would be the most important ones to ask, and at least if you can't come to a final answer about them, at least a partial answer about them. Why? Because they're at the root level of the entire edifice, right? So if you don't ask about that and you're sort of building the entire edifice of psychology on the basis of basically a crappy foundation with respect to how you understand existence, well, then why should you be convinced of any other of the upper levels or floors or whatever? I'm sort of creating a metaphor of a building, I suppose. So science's basic ethic is to subject all knowledge to scientific questioning, but usually science doesn't want to ask about its most basic suppositions of all, namely its assumptions about how reality works in the first place. Instead, sort of the default thing is, well, reality works causally. That's already well known, and we don't really need to ask about that. Oh, is that so? You don't need to ask about that. You're just going to assume that that's correct, because that seems like a direct contradiction of the whole animating spirit of science in the first place. All right, so natural science psychology tends to buy this, I'm describing it as Newtonian, Cartesian, dualistic account without really questioning it, at least very seriously. So then probably the obvious question at this point is, well, why? Why would otherwise smart people not see that? And part of the reason has to do with something that is maybe more prevalent in American culture than it is in other cultures throughout the world. And that is that we tend to worship a lot of the time at the temple of utility. Okay, so if something is useful, it almost automatically means that it's valuable, like if it's useful. And something that seems sort of more abstract or not sort of immediately useful seems a little more dubious or less important or something like that. Well, the thing about taking a natural science approach to psychology is it more easily generates useful solutions to our problems. The problems of mental health, for instance, and how to treat mental health and, like how to come up with, let's say, psychotropic drugs that can alter your subjective experience and thereby treat certain kinds of psychopathology. Well, yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. But there's more to life than that. Okay, so in other words, what makes us think that utility and being useful is sort of the main purpose of psychological inquiry? That's sort of a disturbing question. Maybe the main point is not just to generate things that are useful, although obviously useful things have value for sure, but maybe it's not the main point of the whole thing. Maybe the main point of the whole thing is to understand this riddle into which we've been thrown, human existence, in some kind of meaningful way. Like maybe that's a deeper purpose even than solving problems, which seems to confer an almost automatic, immediate validity on taking a natural science approach to psychology, So why utility? Why would we worship at the temple of utility so often, as though that's the most important thing in life? And I tried to pose some disturbing questions to you in your notes. So is being useful really the be-all, end-all of your existence? Because if it is, guess what? You need to hand over your crown to robots because they're going to be way more utilitarian If they aren't already, they soon will be. Way more utilitarian than you can ever dream of being. You know, so do you fall in love because it's useful? You know, and maybe every now and then someone would say, well, yeah, you know, because really the whole point of falling in love is to sort of propagate your superior DNA, which allows the human race to derive more utilitarian benefits and to sort of engage the demands of reality better. Like every now and then someone might argue that, like sociobiologists might argue that kind of thing. It's like, well, it's all about propagating your DNA anyhow. And that has utilitarian value because it helps the human race adapt to, you know, various adverse conditions and so on. For most people, they probably wouldn't give you that answer. Like the reason why they fall in love is because, well, you know, they're sort of they're interested and curious in what life has to offer. They're interested in feeling a sense of adventure in life, you know, and love and intimacy and sort of like all of these sort of uncertainty and mystery and sort of sense of discovering another person, you know, along the way and sort of what they're about and what they're into and having that sort of that wild moment of like soul contact. I mean, that's why most people fall in love. It's not to be more useful or to make the human race more useful by way of propagating DNA. For the most part, you know, if you ask people, I bet, like the reason why they fall in love is, you know, because they're sort of, you know, intoxicated with the adventure of life, you know, and falling in love is an expression of that. They want to see where things go and what happens, and they're curious, you know, to find out. Okay, how about a more fundamental question? Because some of you are young, maybe you don't have a lot of experience in love and all of that. How about just getting out of the bed in the morning? Is the main reason why you get out of bed in the morning to be useful? And I mean the main reason. So I'm not disputing the fact that part of what gets you out of bed in the morning is to be useful, okay? Be a useful member of society. But is that the main reason? Because I bet the main reason has more to do with the reasons why people fall in love. Like you're interested to see what happens in your life. You know, like you want to see, you know, you want to feel like passion. You want to feel adventure. You know, you want to feel that sort of, that weird, intoxicating pull that life sometimes have. I bet that's why you get out of the bed in the morning. And yeah, once you're out of bed, it's nice to be useful every now and then. Like that is a cool thing. But that's probably not the main reason. Or think of it this way, like why do you listen to music? You know, assuming you do, you know, every now and then someone doesn't. But most people, I would say, like that, man, music is an important thing. And like, yeah, do you really listen to music because it sort of optimizes your efficiency in the workplace? Is that the main reason? Okay, and it might, and by the way, listening to music might make you a more efficient worker, might help you be more utilitarian. But is that the main reason? And I bet not. I bet not. It's because, like, you take delight in human expressiveness. Right? And you love to feel like where music transports you. Like you love to feel like you're flying, and music can make you feel like you're flying. And it's a wonderful thing. And it's like, oh, I've spread my wings on the wind of the world. And I'm lifted high. I can see the far horizon of things because music helps me do that. That's not a utilitarian explanation. So it turns out that utility, like any other value, is arbitrary. Okay, so yes, it's an important thing, but it's not the main point of life. So why should it be the main point of psychology? Just a thought. Okay, so here's the end of this video. We've completed sort of our initial compare and contrast operation. In the next video, we'll be asking the exact same questions about humanistic psychology. So until then, have a great day. Have a wonderful day. See if you can spread the wings of your soul on the wind of this world. Take care.